Afghanistan has changed. So just as we were talking about, everybody has smartphones, is much more connected to the rest of the world. People have been educated, so it's a lot more literate country than it was. So I thought that meant the Taliban couldn't behave as they did last time. I'm afraid I was wrong, because what we're seeing in recent months is exactly as the last time they were in power, and more restrictions coming in. I think they've taken advantage of attention being off Afghanistan and people being focused on Ukraine.
And what is your first impression on that test 1 year on?
So I haven't been here very long so far, but I would say the atmosphere, people seem a bit more fearful actually than they did before. As you know, the leader of Al-Qaeda was killed apparently by the Americans in a drone strike last week, having been apparently living in the center of Kabul since the beginning of the year. So that's really, the Taliban are very angry about the drone strike. They're saying it wasn't him, and the Americans should have consulted them and not just launched an attack in the center of Kabul. Lots of kind of conspiracy theories about who informed them and why he was here. And so that's kind of added to the tension. But of course, we have seen, unfortunately, a lot more restrictions being imposed by the Taliban in recent months, and not least on the media.
Well, let's sort of work through some of those. Because obviously there's restrictions on the media, restrictions on women and girls as well. How, just describe for people who don't know what Afghanistan was like just over a year ago and the progress that had been made.
Yeah. So I've been coming here more than 30 years. And so I've seen enormous changes. And when the Taliban were in power before, in the 90s, this place was really cut off from the rest of the world. And what changed after 9/11 and when the NATO forces came here and the Taliban were removed, and you had 20 years of international forces and presence here, the biggest change was that Afghanistan became much more connected to the rest of the world. Almost everybody you meet, even in rural, remote places, have smartphones, so they see how life is outside. And of course, in that 20 years, there's a lot of focus on education, because when the Taliban were in power before, they had notoriously banned girls from going to school and women from going to work. So a lot of people a lot of girls had not had education. And so there was a big focus on that. And so in those 20 years, millions of girls have been educated. There was still a problem. A lot of girls were not going to school, but, a lot more were. And so, they've grown up thinking, as they should, that women can do anything they like, and that they would be able to go to university if they wanted to get jobs in any field. And we've seen, Afghan women police officers, Afghan female judges, Afghan female film directors, all sorts of things that they have been doing in the last 20 years. And literally overnight, on the 15th of August last summer, that ended. It was heartbreaking for those people who felt that their dreams had been shattered. And I mean, I'm not ashamed to say that when I came then and I was interviewing people, a lot of the interviews just ended in tears, because, it was so difficult to see everything gone like that. And lots of my female friends said to me, it would have been better if you'd never come, if the West had never come, because you gave us hopes and expectations that have just gone.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? In the 90s, they didn't go to school, but that was, that had long been the situation. But having it taken away was even worse than not having had it in the first place. Yeah,
that's what they feel, and I can see why they would feel that. But then, having said that, there are some brave girls and women here who are still going to secret schools that people have set up, because they say, why should we be deprived of our education? I mean, we call them secret schools. They they're not actual schools, they're like rooms in the homes of people or of teachers usually. And the schooling is kind of limited because it's maybe just for an hour a day and it's all different ages mixed together. But it's better than nothing. It gives them some hope. And so some of those girls wrote me a diary, a sort of letter to the world about how they feel and how forgotten, because they just can't understand. And actually, I can't understand either. Afghanistan's the only country on earth where girls can't go to high school. And the rest of the world, people say, oh, this is awful, but no one's actually really doing anything about it.
There was a lot of talk sort of 12 months ago about sort of Taliban 2.0, that it was a new look, modern Taliban for the modern age. Which as the way that things have panned out, schools have closed, the burqa's been brought back, the Ministry for Women became, what was it, the Ministry for Protection of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Has there been any evidence at all that this Taliban is in any real sense different to the old Taliban?
No, you're absolutely right. A year ago, that's what we were all discussing. Is this different? These Taliban, some of them have been living abroad, some of their daughters are going to school. And I used to argue, well, I don't know if the Taliban have changed, but Afghanistan has changed. So just as we were talking about, everybody has smartphones, is much more connected to the rest of the world. People have been educated, so it's a lot more literate country than it was. So I thought that meant the Taliban couldn't behave as they did last time. I'm afraid I was wrong, because what we're seeing in recent months is exactly as the last time they were in power, and more restrictions coming in. I think they've taken advantage of attention being off Afghanistan and people being focused on Ukraine. And so they have said that women should wear the burqa. It's not so far absolutely imposed with, but we all have to cover it. So I wear a black abaya, I cover my head, and so only my face is showing. But they say that women, that's what they should be wearing. And I have friends who've been stopped in places and told, why aren't you wearing a burqa? They've also said that women shouldn't go anywhere without a male companion, that women shouldn't drive or fly without a man, that if women are still working, that they should actually give their job to a male relative. They've said women on TV, there are still some women working on television, should be fully covered, wearing a hijab. And so all of these sort of creeping restrictions, so things have been going in the wrong direction in the last few months. And nobody really knows why that is, because a lot of the individual Taliban leaders, when you meet them, ministers and things, will say, no, we want girls to go to school and we think women should work, etc. But it's not happening. So somebody is actually insisting, no, this is not what's going to happen.
And how is it for you there as a woman and a journalist working? Is your job harder now?
I think it is harder than it was. I mean, I've been back twice since the Taliban took over. And the first time I came, just after they'd taken over, I was quite nervous of how it would be, and was pleasantly surprised that actually it was quite easy to work, that I didn't have any problems. We all have to get a letter from the Taliban when we arrive that we carry around saying that we're allowed to work. And, frankly, also I was finding I could go to places I hadn't been able to go to for years, because the one good thing, if you like, is the security is much better. I'm speaking to you from a hotel which the Taliban twice tried to blow up, and now they're in control of the security here. So it's a very surreal situation. But we are able to go to places, and it's the same for NGOs working. They can go to places they couldn't help people in before. So that is one positive. Again, I was here January, February. It was fine working. This time it feels a bit different. They have been some problems with foreign journalists. They beat up a male journalist recently badly, and he had to leave the country. A female journalist I know was manhandled, which is extremely unusual here, and had a gun pulled on her. Another female journalist was called in and fled the country. So it's not, and there's a much more a feeling of being watched what we do. So that sort of honeymoon period seems to be over.
As well as the Taliban taking over, Christina, Afghanistan, like countries around the world, are being affected by huge levels of inflation. I think the most recent official figures were something like 15% inflation, but for day-to-day, household goods and food, it's multiple times that. And one of the most harrowing things I've ever read, but definitely your writing was back in January. You went to Afghanistan and you wrote about fathers having to choose to sell their daughters, basically, just to get some money to feed the rest of their family. The most desperate situation.
That's right. I wrote about a girl called Fatima, an 8-year-old girl who was sold because the family were starving. Actually, I mean, the good news is a lot of readers contacted afterwards wanting to help, and we were able to help and help the father get some work so that she could be brought back. And so she's going to school. And in fact, after we finish speaking, I'm going to see her. So that's good news. But as you say, the general situation here is just absolutely terrible. I mean, first of all, this is a country, 75% of the budget came from international aid. And overnight last year, when all the foreign troops and foreigners left, that stopped. So suddenly 3/4 of the budget had gone. But also there was a sort of entire economy around that. There were so many foreign organizations and things. They employed lots of people, and all of that has gone. All the embassies have gone, and so a lot of work went. Also, the assets in the central bank, about $9 billion, was frozen. And so there's no liquidity. All the banks have stopped. So people can't access money. So there are actually almost no jobs and lots of people. So this is a crisis. The UN says about 96% of people don't have enough to eat. So it's not just affecting the poorest people. It was, of course, already a very poor country, but it's also middle class, because lots of people who did have jobs, who did have a reasonable lifestyle, lost those jobs when the Taliban took over, either because the Taliban ended things or because the financial crisis. On top of that, we've had the worst drought here in 40 years. The current harvest is much worse than people were expecting. There's a big problem of water shortages. I was talking to a farmer who was saying that he's having to dig 15 feet deeper now to get water. And then, as you say, prices, of course, have gone up of fuel, of commodities because of the war in Ukraine. So I was just talking to the head of the World Food Programme last night, and she was saying, they have a shortfall anyway of the money that they need, a shortfall of 960 million for this year, dollars. And then on top of that, things she was saying probably going to cost $200 million more because of this international crisis. So it's a really miserable situation. And the feeling earlier in the year that a lot of people were really going to starve to death, that so far some aid has come in. The World Food Programme has expanded again, but all they've managed to do, really, they say, is sort of stave off the situation. It's not, the problem's still there. They've just sort of stopped people starving for the next few months, but it's a really awful situation.
I suppose there's a tension there, isn't there? The reason the aid stopped was because the Taliban took over, but it's not. I suppose the hope being that if the Taliban either wasn't there or behaved better, then it would be rewarded with some aid. But it's of no help to the people living there. The Taliban are in control, and there is no money there. But it's a really tough. I suppose it's a moral question for international.
It is a big problem, because at the beginning, everybody poured out, and no one wanted to help Afghanistan. Because of exactly that they didn't want to be dealing with the Taliban. But the fact is, the Taliban are here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to the deputy foreign minister yesterday. He was like, we're not going away. If you don't help us, it's going to take much longer for us to be able to sort out the situation. More people will die. Is that what you want? And that is the problem here, that if you don't give the international support, then you're punishing the Afghan people because you've got a government here that we don't like. Many Afghans don't like that government, but so I think that morally that there are ways of helping people in this country without having to go through the Taliban. Like UNICEF can pay teachers directly.
Yeah.
The World Food Programme. I mean, the irony is, because the bank system doesn't work or anything, they're literally, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but they're flying in pallets of dollars, like $40 million at a time, to be able to buy things here. And so, there is now a lot more international NGOs operating than there were a few months ago, and they're trying to find ways. Of course, you can't. The Taliban are in control. You can't completely ignore them. You need permission from them to go into areas, but the aid doesn't have to be delivered through them. It can be still done directly to people.
And just finally, then, the situation 1 year on. I know you've written before about your fear that Afghanistan was being forgotten in a large part because of the situation in Ukraine, but also, I suppose, the manner and the way the international America and Britain left, in the way that Afghanistan has become a sort of dirty word in sort of, why are we still there? Bring the troops home, walk away from it, essentially. But that the situation, I suppose there's going to be a lot of attention on it over the next week or so as people mark the anniversary of the Taliban taking over. What's your hope for Afghanistan in the future, and why you're there to sort of shine a spotlight on it?
That is such a hard question, Matt, because the sad thing about being here at the moment is it's really hard to find any hope. I mean, they're kind of no good guys. The previous government fled. Afghanistan has had 40 years of war. It's not as if there is some part of the country not controlled by the Taliban from which you could kind of mount some operation. So I think, unpalatable as it might be, any change has to be worked through the Taliban. But it's very difficult because there have been a number of meetings with international diplomats, including British diplomats and Taliban. And I'm afraid all those people say that, they don't feel like they're achieving anything. The feeling at the beginning was, because the country was so desperately in need of international aid, that there would be some leverage for the international community to basically say, if you don't have an inclusive government, if you don't let girls go to school and women to work, we won't give you any help. But actually, the Taliban don't seem to respond to that. They more or less say, well, we've spent 20 years living in the mountains, not with almost nothing to eat, so be it. And, they claim that they're running the economy better. And the one thing seems to be true is that there was a lot of corruption from the last government. This Taliban regime is actually managing to collect as much revenue on the borders of coming in as the previous government was, even though economic activity is down so much. So, and they've got coal mines in the north, which of course now, because of the energy crisis, they're making more money from. But it is a really, really grim situation, and it's hard to see. They don't, as I said earlier, things seem to be going in the wrong direction, not in any way that you could feel optimistic about.